Whoa, those are my eardrums. Got blown by that lady. Okay, meeting's being recorded. Got it.
I'm going to pause the forget. Let me start recording. So Naila, I wanted to start out by saying the word internet governance can be a bit confusing, right? There are many layers to the internet. There's the technical layers, there's the internet infrastructural layers, and then there's the social and application layers that everyday users see. When you talk about internet governance, or when I can't talk internet governance, what do you guys really mean? I mean, what kind of layer in the stack are you guys referring to?
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. Okay, so I am discussing here ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, and I'm one of many organizations and many players that create what's called the internet governance. So I wanted to start out by, typically when we are talking about ICANN and when we're dealing with community members, we usually hear the term that, oh, ICANN governs the internet. So let me just clear that from the beginning. That ICANN does not, this is not the role. It's an inaccurate assumption that ICANN in itself, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, governs the internet. What we're referring to when we talk about ICANN is the in relation to internet governance, we need to make a distinction between internet governance as the concept, the bigger concept, and what we refer to as technical internet governance. And this is where ICANN really resides, in the technical internet governance. And technical internet governance, in this sense that I'm talking about here, is focused on the way the internet works, the components that contribute to a secure, stable, and resilient internet, and therefore the pieces that ICANN helps coordinate. So a crucial aspect of this is, and where where ICANN's role falls, is to maintain and ensure and maintain basically from a technical perspective, adherence to open, apologies. My apologies. So adherence to open and technical standards that maintain a secure and reliable internet. The governance model that ICANN works under, or that ICANN promotes really, is what we call the multi-stakeholder model. It's a process by which players different impacted parties work and contribute to the governance. So it's a multi-stakeholder model. You have governments involved, business, academia, end users, all come together to make a multi-stakeholder model to create this governance model, and contribute to that responsibility that everybody has to preserve an open and a stable and a globally interoperable one internet. So ICANN, I guess, to answer your question, where we fall here is we're in the technical space. We're working with two different pillars, really. There is a technical component to ICANN's work and how it conducts its work, and then there's a non-technical component that's more focused on getting together the multi-stakeholders and implementing policies that impact us all. And that's really where ICANN goes, and I can, if you want, I can go a little bit further into the technical part of that internet governance if you want.
Yeah, that would be great. That was actually my next question, Naila, and to dig a little deeper. So I like that distinction between a technical and then maybe more of a actual, maybe application level governance model, which I think a lot of us identify, right? We see content moderation, or we see companies being liable for hosting, but it seems like ICANN is one level deeper. And if you can maybe elucidate that for us and explain how maybe ICANN and other groups like Internet Registries kind of form that coalition of groups that do coordinate and do, in a sense, stabilize the operation of this very, very big public project.
Yes, thank you. Yes, let's go into that. So when we're working with ICANN, and I mentioned the technical pillar and a non-technical, so I'm going to go into the technical one. So this role is embodied into what ICANN looks after when if it's major technical functions. It's called the IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. This role is basically the ICANN serves here is a coordination and administration of unique identifiers on the internet. And these include three things. They include domain names, they include IP addresses, and protocol parameters. Domain names here, we're talking where ICANN role is the top level domains. So when you're working with a domain name, you're going www.icann.org, for example, the .org is your top level domain. And there's about 1,500 of them right now in what we call the DNS root zone. There's generic ones like .org and .com and .info and .shop, etc. And then there's about 300 or so that are dedicated to countries. So .us and .mx and .de for Germany, etc. And that's where the domain namespace, that's where it's responsible for that domain namespace. The IANA function for working through ICANN coordinates the delegation or putting these new domain names, these top level domain names in the root zone, therefore they're becoming operational for everybody to use them, and then doing maintenance and changes to those top level domains as needed, as per the direction of those entities that operate those top level domains. The running of those top level domains, the whole DNS system depends on something called delegation, right? So ICANN delegates the name to an entity to operate it and delegates the responsibility. That's how the domain name system works, right? You then delegate the name and the responsibility. So ICANN acts as the administrator and the central repository where those entities that are operating these top level domains are named and assigned. And then the running of those domain names happens by those different entities. That's on the DNS level. That's in the domain name coordination part of ICANN's work. Then a very second and a very major component of that is IP addresses. So all of us, in order for us to be able to access the internet, we are using unique IP addresses, right? Internet protocol number addresses. ICANN has a large pool of IP addresses that it assigns to 5 regional internet registries around the world. So ICANN gives fairly sizable chunks at a time according to policy developed by the internet community. It assigns a chunk at a time to each of the regional internet registries. And the regional internet registries then turn around and assign them to their customers. So they are the ones that are assigning them to their ISPs, internet service providers, and other organizations, again, as they request them per policy for that organization. So now we talked about the DNS part, which is the domain name system, the IP address part, and then there's a third component that ICANN is also coordinating, which is protocol parameters. And those protocol parameters are basically a central repository of protocol names and numbers. So different registries used in many internet protocols. So many of these applications that we use are relying on these protocol parameters that are defined hand in hand by the community through the umbrella of the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. And so the Internet Engineering Task Force defines these protocol parameters, defines the registries to be created, and sends them over to IANA in its ICANN home. And then IANA is the one that's creating these registries and maintaining them according to the standard that was defined by the IETF, or the Internet Engineering Task Force. So that's the major technical part of what ICANN is looking after through this IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority function. Then the second pillar, or what we call the policy development pillar, this is the one that's looking at developing policy to govern these different aspects and to specifically govern the domain name space of it. Because the second part, what I talked about, which is the IP addresses and the IETF, that is handled through the regional internet registries and the IETF. So the domain name space is where ICANN is convening communities and the multi-stakeholder model to create policies to govern that domain name space. One of those governance models, for example, is managing the system of registries and registrars for the domain names around the world. So when you go register a domain name, let's say you're registering jeremybernick.org, for example, you're dealing with a registrar who's following rules of how to register that domain name and all that stuff. And ICANN maintains that registries and registrars model that is helping with that process. And that's what businesses around the world and people who are looking to operate websites, that's what they're relying on, and that's what they're using. So as I'm explaining then, this governance model of ICANN is really limited in its scope and in its remit to very specific technical aspects and very specific policy aspects. And the whole thing really, at the end of the day, relies on everyone getting together and agreeing that this is what we want, and we want to keep this internet open and interoperable and available for all of us to contribute to. I hope that.
No, that was a great, really broad, great introduction to a lot of this. And what I'm kind of fascinated by, as somebody who's been in the field for a little bit, is how this very technical subject matter that intersects very dynamic and, sometimes complicated global issues like digital access and sovereignty questions related to domain names. It seems like the community is made up of a large coalition of people, right? It's not all computer scientists. It's a lot of academics. It's a lot of civil society members. It's a lot of industry individuals. Where in the ICANN process or in the governance formulation initiative ICANN did the idea that it should be this multi-stakeholder experience come up? Because intuitively, when you have this very technical structure, right, you would think you would want to delegate that right to parties that might not be doing it just out of the goodness of their heart and to volunteer. Like, this is a very foundational part of the human experience today. And so it's almost a little scary to hear that there's volunteers, primarily operating these, core functions. So if you could speak a little bit to that, that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, certainly. So the multi-stakeholder model, as you described it, in itself, it grew organically. Nobody sat down and designed a multi-stakeholder model the way we know it now. The history behind how ICANN came together to organize these efforts and the different contributors to it in the ecosystem. This all started in, I believe, so the internet goes back to what? I think we're on year 53, I think, from when the internet officially started. I think it was roughly 53 years. But I think as this model started, as the internet started to grow and businesses realized that this is something that needs stability and needs a home and needs multiple entities to contribute to it, that's when ICANN was founded, and that was back in 1998. And it was really founded as a place to house the IANA functions, which were being operated out of USC, actually, University of Southern California, Information Sciences Institute, I believe it's ISI. So all of this coordination was done out of some university department somewhere in USC. And then ICANN was created as a home to put these IANA functions in. And that's where the whole the concept of ICANN came together. And there was a lot of coordination that went on back then, and it would be interesting to go over that history sometime. But certainly ICANN, that's when ICANN's bylaws were created and its scope was defined. And even the IANA functions, it wasn't just handed to ICANN and say, here, go run this. There was a coordination between the US government and ICANN to look after these IANA functions. But certainly in the creation of ICANN, it was envisioned that ICANN would convene a multi-stakeholder community, basically, to govern these resources on the internet and to include different players around the ecosystem to be included in the governing of ICANN. But also it wasn't envisioned that ICANN would bring everyone that's ever involved in ICANN into the ICANN umbrella. That's not the vision today or 30 years ago when ICANN was founded in 1998. So ICANN does this with a multitude of players, and ICANN is just one of many organizations in the ecosystem. So you've got I referred to the IETF. So they have this thing called the I-STAR system. So a bunch of organizations that start with the I's. So you have the IETF, that's a very major player, the Internet Engineering Task Force, where engineers basically get together and work on standards. You've got ICANN. You've got the RIRs, which is the different regional internet organizations, internet registries around the world, one per region. So we have 5 of them. We've got Internet Society looking after this as well, aspects of involving internet society, end users into internet society as well. We have top-level domain managers, those assigned entities to operate domain names. We've got the root server operators. This is a very, you talk about a voluntary system. The root server operators who are, this is 13 and this is 12 organizations operating 13 identities, but with multiple copies of each identity that are serving the root server system. So all these queries that are going to the internet are being operated out of from the root server system. And that's a network of volunteers as of this moment. It's organizations that are doing this because they've agreed to do this and because they see the value in doing this. But it's all, I would say, this is all evolving. I think this is something that it continues to evolve. The root server system, for example, is currently looking at itself and looking at its governance model and saying, you know, should we create some accountability to each other and accountability to the internet users of the world, and how do we keep up with the demands that are coming to us as the internet just becomes more and more part of our everyday life. So it's an evolving system. It's not set up to be working one specific way. And that's why I think participation and involvement from everyone across the spectrum, sessions like this, where we're talking about why it's so important to be involved and let yourself be heard, is extremely important.
Yeah, that's really refreshing to hear. I think a lot of really foundational governance decisions aren't always in the hands of everyday people like us, right? We've built a lot of institutions that prioritize a much more diplomatic and professionalized governance structure, and oftentimes some of those models, or most of those models, don't effectively meet either end users or the technical experts like us who might have a better idea of how these systems operate and how they can be improved. For the sake of time, I'll just ask one more question, Naila. The purpose of this event is really to reach out to other young people who are interested and that might have a technical background or might just have a general interest in internet-related things or governance-related issues. What would you say to young people in the audience or who might see this at a later date about how to get involved either with ICANN or with the I-STAR system, as you mentioned? And what route would be effective to take if they wanted a career or a legacy in these institutions?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I can't emphasize to you how important that is. And thank you for bringing that up. I think a lot of our organizations, the ICANN, the RIRs, like I said, the Internet Governance Forum, we all realize that this internet is not for us. This is for many generations to come. And unfortunately, young professionals and youth, while the internet is their everyday life, right? There is nothing that they don't do that involves the internet every day. They are sorely missing from these conversations. And I think this is something that many of our organizations believe and have programs in place that they want to fix, that they want to use to attract young professionals into this. So while we're speaking here, I'm going to put some links in the chat that I hope can be further used. But many of the organizations that I mentioned, including ICANN, have what we call our fellowship programs and next generation programs. ICANN itself just launched a new program called ICANN for Beginners that's specifically targeted on how to introduce this whole concept to people and get them involved and participating in ICANN and similar organizations. So we have also really done a lot more in the last, I would say 18 months to 3 years, with involving ourselves in academia and going to universities and making these presentations in universities. So I would say, please be open. Please know that this impacts you as it impacts me and it impacts everyone. Participate, find these programs. I know these programs can seem intimidating, but unless you get involved, things won't change. And I know things that I think we're all coming out of the last 3 years of realizing how much important it is for us as individuals to be involved in our lives and how our lives are decided every day and how our information is shared over internet and with whom. And so my call to everybody here today is please participate. And I'm going to use the next few minutes to put a few links here for people to get engaged if possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Naila. And I just wanted to add that what is even sweeter about what ICANN does is it really promotes community. So speaking on the experience of somebody who has been a fellow, it's one of the few organizations where they will pay for you to travel around the world to participate in these really important forums and to meet other people who are doing this very important governance work. So you have access to all these really interesting people who just, in their free time are interested in contributing to this global project. I mean, I think few other organizations have that entry point. Either have to be, a veteran of the industry or an employee, but ICANN has done a really good job of, bridging the gap between the newcomers and, the kind of seasoned veterans in that field. So thank you, Naila. Just to reiterate for anybody who's come in a little late, Naila Saris is the VP of North American stakeholder engagement for ICANN, one of the major players in the internet governance landscape. We're really grateful to have her here today. She's a fountain of knowledge on all things ICANN and internet governance. We have ended a little early, so we'll take a couple minutes. If there's any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If not, we will just set up for our next session with Nick Nugent.
Did you want to start now, or did you want to?
Yeah, we might as well, Nick. I think that would be good. Let me just pull up your slide real quick. Perfect. Okay, so for session 2, we have Nick Nugent. And we'll be talking about the state of affairs in global internet governance. Nick is a Karsh Fellow and lecturer at the University of Virginia Law School. Nick and I have done internet governance work in the past together at the regional internet registries. And Nick is now the new elect for the NRO Council at ARIN, the North American Internet Registry. So we're really excited to have Nick, who has a really interesting lens from an academic's perspective, but also as somebody now in a leadership role within the community. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. Hey, Nick, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks very much for inviting me, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to speak with and to these folks.
Wonderful, wonderful. So Nick, building off of that first kind of foundational session, right, with Naila, where we're kind of building out the landscape and the idea of what internet governance is, and we're looking first at probably the broadest institution being ICANN, which seems to have maybe the most public-facing or a general awareness. Let's dive a little bit deeper into kind of where the academic community stands and where the scholarship and field of internet governance is going, and what kind of questions people are asking about this kind of wonky technical topic.
Sure.
So for my first question, I wanted to bring up kind of who maybe you and I would label as the father of internet governance, Milton Mueller, who's an academic at Georgia Tech and runs the Internet Governance Project. If anybody is interested in reading more or learning more about this topic, they've had a recent forum in the last month. And in this forum, they were talking about the longevity of the idea of the field of internet governance as it matures and as it grows. So the field as itself has probably been around for about 20 years or so, with the start of ICANN and other groups that were, formed to do the technical governance work that took over the role of people like John Postel and others who are just doing this, in the back room of USC or other places.
Right.
So one of the questions that Milton asked was, is internet governance the right way to describe this? And I think Naila really got into an interesting point about this in saying that there's the actual governance, or maybe the application level governance questions that societal and users are seeing. And then there's the technical governance that you and I and other people who are attending these forums and are doing the actual policy building work sort of see. And Milton said that maybe we should be changing this to digital political economy, looking at the kind of macro landscape of interactions, both between these governance models and society at large. Do you think that this field's framing, this new digital political economy, is the direction to go? And do you see this as, kind of an area where emerging topics can form that haven't been historically talked about in internet governance?
Yeah, I can understand why Milton is keen to revisit the umbrella term for the field. I mean, if you look at his organization, the Internet Governance Project, and the blog, internetgovernance.org, and then you read many of the posts that are on there, he's talking about chips. He's talking about blockchain. He's talking about artificial intelligence. He's talking about cybersecurity. Are those things really internet governance? Well, not in the classic sense. In the classic sense, as one of the panelists in that conference stated, it's really identifier governance. It's the governance of, as Naila very helpfully described, it's the governance of names and numbers, of domain names and IP addresses. Even one thing that's crucially missing from that is the governance of networks. Networks are obviously the physical infrastructure over which the internet operates, and that's not historically, and I think even to very much currently, in the ambit of ICANN or even the RIRs, probably a little bit more of the RIRs just because of things like RPKI. But for example, NANOG, the North American Network Operators Group, they're looking at things like peering and bandwidth and capacity and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it's funny, I would say that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you met someone who called himself or herself an internet scholar, that person would be pretty deep in domain names, some degree in address policy. Today, you meet an internet scholar, and this person might be focused on, gosh, any number of topics: platform regulation, blockchain, artificial intelligence, algorithmic discrimination, critical internet theory. And this is an emerging thing. And we're just looking at it through so many different lenses. And some of these people might have not the foggiest clue about how the core infrastructure operates. And I don't mean that in any sort of critical way. It's the internet is becoming so ubiquitous and so central to so many facets of private life, economic life, political life, even military and state operation, that it's a big umbrella and a big tent for a lot of different scholarship to take place and a lot of different issues to be analyzed. And Milton's right in that internet governance is kind of a misnomer for all of that stuff. Now, whether the umbrella term should be digital political economy, I think that can be debated. There was a fair amount of pushback in that conference against that particular term, just because it seemed to some to be unduly materialistic. And also there, for example, there are many aspects of the scholarship that could touch on things like sociological and cultural phenomena that aren't really in the scope of state or markets. But another criticism that I thought was spot on is that if we call it digital political economy, or maybe I'll even back up, I think if we're going to have an umbrella term, maybe, in my field, law, we tend to refer to as law and tech. Ever since the law and economics movement proved wildly popular, everybody's like, well, law and psychology, law and, tech, it's law and asterisk. So we would call it law and tech. Maybe a even better umbrella term might be just tech policy, if you're going to talk about these things. But if you call it tech policy, then you definitely lose something, because then if you sort of use that term to the exclusion of internet governance, you lose that tight grouping of scholars and policy wonks who attend the ARIN meetings, who attend the ICANN meetings, who are looking at very narrow things like allocation policies for experimental IP address space, very wonky, nerdy stuff. And it's very important to maintain that group of scholars and policymakers and participants as a discrete body, and not just for an expertise function, but also as an insulating function. Part of Mueller's argument is that tech is so pervaded, the internet is so pervaded everything, that we have to take into account what states want to do in this space and how markets are affecting it and how commerce runs through it. That's all well and good, and I agree with that, but there's also quite a risk, I would think the internet governance folks would say, in getting those players into the fold. I don't mean to sound like I want to be exclusionary. Obviously, it's a multi-stakeholder process, but I was just at ARIN's last meeting and NANOG's last meeting, and I didn't meet very many economists. I didn't meet any economists. I didn't meet any government officials. They might have been there. I didn't meet them. And I think that the participants in that community would say that's very good. Not, again, because it's a matter of excluding them, but because they think that this really can be a nerd science where we can just look at the number policy and the domain policy in a way that is very thoughtful in terms of internet stability and operation, without having to look at states, economics, even culture. And so there's a value in maintaining that as a distinct grouping of scholars and interest.
That's very fascinating. I kind of like that phrasing, and it almost, I like the framing of insularity as maybe not a negative connotation, but as something that does promote the very technical remit, as I was saying, that this isn't something that broadens the scope beyond, everyday impacts on end users, but is something solely of the technocratic variety. And I think that's very interesting. What do you see as, maybe to push back on that a bit, a benefit of adding, say, economists or ethicists or other people to conversations that traditionally aren't inclusive of those, or maybe not inclusive, but aren't welcoming those parties, in the sense that the work is so technical that even the downstream effects do have impact. One could argue, but those people aren't in the room to make those decisions and to open up those conversations. Or is that more the function of other groups within the ecosystem of internet governance, say like IGF or other parties? Do you see any distinction between how the landscape is now, or that it needs to become more centralized, maybe into one or two broader institutions?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of hypocrisy in what I just said, because I'm someone who looks at the socio-cultural, economic, geopolitical dimensions of internet governance. Maybe I just want to reserve the space to myself, which is totally unfair. I guess there's a distinction, though, between analyzing this and having too much of an influence. I think we do want it to be a fairly technical remit, and I think we should obviously consider all these things, but I think that there's health in keeping a narrow focus. And I'm not dogmatic on that. I think there are legitimate arguments that can be made in the other direction. So I guess I would say I have an open mind on that. Your question about centralization, maybe you can unpack that a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm talking maybe more about recent events in the internet governance world. So say like the African situation where there's 5. So for those in the room, there are 5 continental, broadly continental internet registries that distribute IP addresses to ISPs and other buyers. And one of them for the African region has recently come under litigation and other financial troubles to where they can't functionally operate. I mean, I think they've had their assets frozen. That isn't technically what, centralization wouldn't have fixed the African situation, right? Because I think that in the end, African technical engineers and network operators probably have a better idea of what that landscape and what those ISPs need than say people in Brussels or in Geneva. But is there a need for centralization maybe in other aspects, say the cultural entities that make up our system? So, the IGFs and other groups that sort of function on the more public-facing, public affairs side of our field. Because I think one of the dangers that you speak of and that others have spoke of is this fear of institutional capture from, say, states or market actors that might have intents or interests that don't meet the global internet, users' interests. I mean, so is there a need for the continuing of our current cultural and social institutions within this very technical field, or should we consolidate or expand on these? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm going to pivot a little bit on your question because I think it touches upon one of the broader emerging debates within internet governance, which is the role of states. What was remarkable about the IANA transition? So as Nyala talked about, ICANN was formed in 1998. At the time, the United States had basically entire control over internet governance. It had control over the naming and numbering functions. And then ICANN was transitioned to a global multi-stakeholder system in 2016 and sort of given to the international community. But it was transitioned to a private stakeholder institution. So, I mean, even just describing my role. So I'm on the Number Resources Organization Number Council, acronym salad for Aaron. What is my role? Well, I'm one of 3 members on that board, on that council, and then each of the 5 regional internet registries also has a council. So 15 of us total, and then we play a role in appointing a member of ICANN's board, and then there are the name organizations. The DNS community appoints a member of the board. It's a very large board with a number of seats, and then this board makes certain decisions, and it's very technocratic and meritocratic. And the government organizations, Nyala can correct me if I'm misstating fact here, they have a role in the community, but they don't have a vote on the board. So it's just remarkable that something that runs the world, the governments don't have any official stake in. And that is, I mean, it's actually mind-boggling. And so one of the big tensions and debates in internet governance right now is what role states should have. And many would say 0.0, and this is exactly as it should be. And I'm very sympathetic to that. But you have a number of states that are saying this cannot continue indefinitely because there are security implications, there are national security implications, there are human rights implications, there are, even just critical infrastructure operation. We need to have a role. ICANN and this private governance is the wrong model. We need to shift to a multilateral model, which would have the nations participate in internet governance like the United Nations. And you're familiar with this, but the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, is an agency within sub-agency of the United Nations, and it's responsible for the coordination of the traditional telephone network. And it has very little role in internet governance, or at least internet governance as we've talked about and defined it. And some say that the internet governance should shift to the ITU. And so there was a recent election of the I forget the secretary.
Yeah,
Secretary
General.
Secretary General. I always forget the precise title. The Secretary General of the ITU, and the election competition was between a U.S. candidate, Doreen Bogdan Martin, and a Russian candidate, Ismailov, I think was his name. And the Russians, I think, the Russians overplayed their hand in this. They were very clear that they wanted their candidate to come in and to affect a transition of internet governance to the ITU, away from ICANN and this private multi-stakeholder. That he was soundly defeated, and the U.S. candidate has said, I have no intention of appropriating these internet governance functions, but this push is going to become stronger over time, and in a certain sense, one doesn't have to convince the ITU to take over. One doesn't have to win the ITU, and one doesn't have to win ICANN to shift global internet governance, as, and maybe I'm jumping ahead quite a bit here, but as different states are beginning to experiment with national networks. RUNET is an example where Russia wants to build its own sovereign internet that is largely disconnected from the broader internet. China has done something similar for years by virtue of the Great Firewall. Brazil is flirting with this and whatnot. And so in a certain sense, they don't need to win the bureaucratic battle to reorient these institutions or take over territory. They can actually just slowly divest of the current model. And if enough nations do that, our current institutions could become obsolete. And so that's that sort of hot, exotic, topic that I think is going to pervade internet governance for the next few decades.
Yeah, you stole my question, Nick. That was where I was going as well.
Sorry.
That is also what I wanted to ask you about, is not only is this schism happening between private governance institutions like ICANN and the IETF, which traditionally have set forward policy and standards for this global internet base, but there's also now this schism between independent sovereign actors who are taking unilateral action to sort of define their own internet sovereignty. And so there's tons of really interesting elements to that. I wanted to also bring up one additional thing to that, is we are talking about a very obscure sub-agency of the UN, and we are talking about a very obscure field of policymakers and technical experts at ICANN and these other internet governance institutions who largely do work that is invisible and that is voluntary. But yet something happened in the last 5 or so years where the increasing politicization of this field has made it into something that has become at times a global touch point. So recently in this election with the ITU, we had the the US Secretary of State, do campaigning on behalf of this. And so this agency, which historically—
Joe Biden issued a supportive statement as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and that's very fascinating because
he did not issue a supportive statement for my election campaign for Aaron, sadly.
Maybe next
time. Yeah.
But exactly, Nick, and I think that is something that we need to think about, is not only are there this kind of Hydra-like schism between all of these parties, but there's also like a top-down pressure from global leaders who are becoming increasingly aware that this asset, sovereign internet networks and internet user base, can be used as a tool of control and a tool of information dissemination. So can you speak a little bit more, because I think it makes sense probably from a technical level, but what does it mean to have a sovereign internet, and what does that look like for information blackouts and something like internet shutdowns and other things like that that are also becoming a little bit more frequent and scary for a lot of the internet user base.
Yeah, I think a good overarching label for this topic is probably internet fragmentation. And internet fragmentation can take a variety of forms. You can have hard fragmentation, like I just described, where you have true national networks, where a computer in Russia cannot reach a computer outside of Russia without sort of going through some gate, some port that negotiates which communications get through and which don't, that your IP address is not accessible to me if I'm in Russia, where Russia can even have its own separate IP internet protocol with its own address space, where Facebook.com, when accessed from Russia, accesses a very different site run by a different entity than when it's accessed by people in the UK or in South Africa, splitting of the root, so to speak. So you can have true technical fragmentation, and there are a number of people looking at that. It's one of my research focuses as well. But then there's a sort of softer fragmentation that's already happening. The hard fragmentation is sexy because it's very, it's dramatic and it's exotic. But the softer fragmentation is already happening. You have the EU incrementally and steadily regulating US platforms more and more to make them comply with local regulations, to the point where you'll have a very different experience on a certain platform if you're in the UK, or no, let's not use UK as an example, but although the UK is quite active in this space as well, but if you're in, say, Brussels, as you are in the United States, where the EU is striving to beef up its local cottage industry of tech and platform providers, which is comparatively weak relative to certain other markets, and where you'll have very different not internet service providers, but platform providers, very different search engines. You just have a completely different experience in one part of the world versus the other. It's playing out in local content requirements in your streaming services, as places like Canada say you must produce X amount of your content must concern Canadian issues, Canadian geography, Canadian culture. I think Britain has something similar. It's playing out in privacy regulations that are preventing companies from providing meaningful services in some cases to residents of the EU because of the inability to export their personal data. It's playing out in local landing laws. For example, Russia, last year, or was it the year before, passed a law that would require tech companies to have a local presence, to have some form of local footprint there. Why? I don't think it's necessarily because they want the commerce. It's because once you have a local presence there, you have a pain point. Censor this opinion, block this person, do this, or else we can arrest your employees here and we can seize your assets. So this soft fragmentation is already happening. And I don't think that our current governance institutions, ICANN, ARIN, IETF, can really do much about it. This is just regulation and policy that's making it happen. Yeah, I have a few more thoughts on that, but I've been talking a while, so I'll pause.
Yeah, I would like to push on that a little bit more and maybe suggest something counterintuitive and maybe a little bit scary, but I think it's traditionally assumed that a global singular internet is the right answer, right? It is what we should be striving for. We are this globalized community of individuals and economic, engines that are collaborating all the time. But in a sense, I think that mystifies a lot of who controls and what powers traditionally govern these structures. Mm-hmm. So I know that ICANN and other private governance institutions are at least trying to rebuke that trend, but for the most part, a lot of the operators, a lot of the platforms, a lot of the main drivers of policy come from either the EU or the US tech markets, right? And they don't include a lot of major other groups. And part of the reaction potentially from the Chinese government or the Russian government is saying these platforms don't reflect what, real users in our countries want, and what, our, what would benefit our economy is to have a nationalized tech industry like in China. And so I wonder if part of this is that our governance model hasn't taken into account that we have sovereign local interest, right, that could benefit from on the ground operational and network and policy choices that don't reflect the macro, environment that, say, urban America chooses. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and that's a really astute comment. So I think the general trend is to bemoan the internet fragmentation. I think this is a grand betrayal of the original internet project, is this global network where anybody can reach anybody and all information is equally accessible. And part of that is very understandable. If the internet is global in that sense, it can provide a liberating function. It played a role in the Arab Spring, for example. Information is power, especially against repressive regimes, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But then you have, and I think your traditional internet governance folks would be very, very staunch globalists in that regard. Understandably so. They were there from the beginning, and they don't want to see their their original creation changed in this way. But you have others like Jack Goldsmith and Tim Wu, and even you. I don't know if you meant to do it on purpose, but you said, "Who controls the internet?" And that's the title of a very famous book that was written. And their argument is, look, a bordered internet is not necessarily a bad thing. That these sovereign states have sovereign interests in their own culture. We don't like when they are providing their citizens less rights fewer rights than we would have. But we can't necessarily export our culture and our norms to all countries. The U.S. Constitution, the First Amendment, is an anomaly in the global system, just as, and many countries think it goes too far, just as we perhaps think that certain European and other data regulations, privacy protection, goes too far as well. And so there's much to be said that a bordered internet in some fashion is a salutary development. And even if it's not, I think it's fairly inevitable that we're moving in this direction. So I would put myself very much in the moderate category in that regard as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Candidly, I'm undecided because I think there are, many forces and effects from these choices that we don't quite know yet, and could be very positive or negative. I want to use this last 5 minutes, Nick, to address a question that actually one of our other panelists has. Jack, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I'll just ask this quickly, and I'm by no means an expert in this topic of internet fragmentation, but it struck me that Jeremy's question about like these companies arising out of China, having developed independently there, whether it's better to have this like sovereign platform, things that are focused on their own use cases. The creation of Alibaba is actually an interesting relation to this, where Jack Ma, who had visited the US and was aware of internet developments in the 90s, saw that there was a need for a more Chinese approach, I would say, to delivering the content. And he created the company kind of with that in mind. But if I'm wondering what your thoughts are now, if you imagine a situation where, say, from the beginning, China had only a sovereign network, whether that would have developed or whether it took some critical mass from competing with like US companies and others to actually develop.
Yeah, I don't know as though I have the right tools to answer that question in terms of the business side. I guess I look at it more primarily from the regulatory side and the internet policymaking side. So I guess I don't fully understand the question with respect to Alibaba. Are you referring to the state's efforts?
Yeah, here, let me see if I can like reframe this question more discreetly. So if the trend is towards these sovereign networks as opposed to a global, collective network, innovation, I guess, seems like it was spurred in the case of Alibaba because of
Oh, I
this
see what you're saying.
ability to access international markets and work across them. And I think you could see even today that its success is partly driven by
Yeah.
that it's outside of there. But I guess that's my question is like, is there some incentive in terms of growth or like innovation from a global network as opposed to sovereign?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, and that is one of the arguments that the opponents of internet fragmentation frequently marshal. They say the internet is generative. It allows the serendipity of coming across new ideas and other ways of doing things and copying and innovating. And I think that there can be little doubt that a bordered internet would hamper innovation. But just like there can be little doubt that aggressive privacy protections, while well-intentioned and maybe the correct approach, hamper trade. And so, you have all these competing considerations. And when it comes to states, they sometimes balance these things wisely, sometimes they balance them unwisely. And I think that in the balance of considerations, these states are okay with the dampening effect on innovation and on trade and on other things if it means maintaining their culture, for example, in the case of Canada, if it means maintaining their control over even just their power in other countries. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the downsides of fragmenting and bordering the internet.
Before we continue, I just wanted to interject one additional point that I think adds some interest and ties back to Naila here. There is a movement within ICANN to universalize domain names. So we use Latin-based scripts or historically have used Latin-based scripts for a majority of our internet domains. But if you are a Russian user or a Chinese user or a
Arabic.
Yeah, Arabic user, right? You're using a different script. And so the internet is inherently this project that is linguistically inaccessible to you. And so I think part of this interest and part of these questions about bordering and culture and all this is like, does it reflect like the most accessible and available form of the internet for all parties? And I know that private internet governance institutions like ICANN are doing a lot to address that and have over the last 10 years, which is really, really an exciting development. But I think that speaks to some of these questions that came out of the vacuum of kind of coordinated leadership and development of the internet. It was this very rushed experiment. And now we are here today trying to put all the pieces back together. So with that, I wanted to say thank you so much, Nick. It's always really interesting to hear your perspective. You have a really great eye on topics from a very intersectional landscape. Next,
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, of course, Nick. Thank you so much. Next, I want to introduce session 3. For session 3, we are going to diverge from talking about internet governance directly, and we're going to move more towards what a quantum network would look like. So in this next session, we will be bringing in various experts on different topics within the landscape of quantum networks. First, we're going to start with Max Thomas, who's a first-year PhD candidate at the University of Arizona Physics, who's going to talk about the kind of fundamentals of quantum mechanics and physics as it relates to optics and the internet and signal transmission. And then we'll move to Jack Postlewaite, who is a second-year PhD candidate in the optics department, who will be speaking about the hardware and other components needed for next-gen networks. And then finally, we'll be moving to David City, who is a resident fellow at Yale's ISP, which is one of the oldest internet governance or internet governance adjacent intellectual groups. And David is also a visiting professor at Yale. He'll be speaking about some of the more application level social and technical aspects of quantum networks. So with that, oops, sorry about that. Is that coming from me?
Yeah, I think it stopped.
Okay, perfect. With that, I want to introduce Max. Max will be presenting on the fundamentals of QM. Go for it, Max.
All right, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right, perfect. Thank you for the nice introduction there, Jeremy. like Jeremy said, I'm going to be talking about some of the fundamental science necessary to understand the current internet and also the future of the quantum internet. So I'm hoping in this presentation, we will all walk away with maybe a deeper understanding or a refreshment of our understanding of what information is, how information is stored and communicated via the electromagnetic field. And then also I want to give a broad introduction of the theory of quantum mechanics, and also touch on some of the key properties that makes quantum systems exploitable for next generation communication and computation. So, okay. Starting off with information. So obviously the internet is a way we transmit information, but we need a fundamental understanding of what this entity of information is. And it can be thought of as a quantity which reduces our uncertainty of a system. And a bit is a fundamental unit of information which reduces our uncertainty by a factor of 2. So you can think of a bit of information as the answer to a yes or no question. And a nice example of this is of a fair coin toss. If I toss a coin, it's either going to be heads or tails. I have 2 possible outcomes. I need a single bit of information to specify the outcome of that. Similarly, if I toss 2 coins, there are 4 possibilities. A single bit will reduce the number of possibilities down to 2, and I would need 2 bits to completely describe this system. And so I'll come back to information in a second, but before we go there, I want to introduce some properties of light. So light is a wave in the electromagnetic field, often called a photon, and it is the force carrier or the boson of this field. And a light wave can be characterized by a few different parameters: its frequency, its speed, its amplitude, and its polarization in the field. So frequency can be thought of as how fast the wave is oscillating, how many periods it makes per second. That is inversely proportional to the wavelength, which you see here. Wavelength is a measure of, obviously, the length of the wave in the field. We also have the amplitude of the wave. So depending on how large the oscillations are, there will be a bigger or smaller amplitude. And then there's also the polarization of this wave. So this light wave here is polarized in the X direction. You can see the electromagnetic field, or it's oscillating in the X electric field. But you could think of rotating this wave about an axis, and its polarization would change depending on its orientation in space. So we can encode information into an electromagnetic wave in a series of different ways. So first off, it's important to note that any classical message can be encoded and subsequently decoded as a sequence of zeros or ones, a series of yes or no questions, a number of bits, like I specified before. And some common ways to encode these sequences of ones and zeros into a wave is through frequency modulation, amplitude modulation, or polarization encoding. So in frequency modulation, as you can see here on this picture on the far left here, we have a period of long frequency indicating a 1, and then periods of short frequency indicating a 0. So with a proper apparatus to receive this wave and decode it, I can transmit a message of 1, 0, 0, 0. Similarly, with amplitude modulation, it's the same concept, just modulating the amplitude to encode this information. And with polarization encoding, you can imagine having a X polarized wave indicating a 1, a Y polarized wave indicating a 0, and you can encode any number of bits through that process. So that was a bit on a broad understanding of classical information and classical electromagnetism, but clearly we are at the Center for Quantum Networks, and I would be remiss if I didn't give a broad overview of quantum theory and some of its important properties and applications. So broadly, quantum mechanics is an incredibly successful physical theory that describes the behavior of very small physical systems like molecules, atoms, and elementary particles. And I want to highlight some of the key differences between classical systems and quantum systems. Firstly, that of superposition. Prior to measurement, a quantum state, often designated by psi in a little bracket here, can be written as a linear combinations of orthogonal states. So I've decomposed this state into the phi basis, and we can see that this state psi is written as this linear combination of states. It's important to note that when we measure a state, we only observe the system to ever be in a single state. We never observe a superposition. But prior to the measurement, the physical state is appropriately described as a superposition. And the classic example, obviously, is of Schrodinger's cat, right? Before we open the box, the cat is in a superposition of being alive or dead. The next point I want to highlight is that of uncertainty. In classical systems, the uncertainty associated with our measurements is due to experimental limitations of our apparatus or of our calculation, things of that nature. But in quantum mechanics, there is an inherent uncertainty to the measurement of certain observable quantities that cannot be overcome with any technological advancement. And the classic example is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle for position and momentum, which says that the uncertainty associated with a position measurement multiplied by the uncertainty with a momentum measurement has to be larger than h bar over 2. So we cannot know these two quantities simultaneously with arbitrarily high accuracy. The final thing I want to touch on in quantum theory is that of entanglement. And entanglement is really at the heart of quantum mechanics and perhaps is the most fundamental phenomenon in quantum theory. Broadly, entanglement can be described as non-local correlations in a system's physical properties. But what do I really mean by that? So suppose I prepare an entangled spin state of electrons and I measure their spin in some direction theta, right? So I create these entangled electrons prior to measurement. They're in this entangled superposition spin state. When I measure them in some direction, call it theta, if I measure particle 1 to be spin up in that direction, I immediately know electron 2 is spin down in that direction. That is the idea of entanglement. These particles' properties are inherently correlated. But how does this correlation occur? How do these particles know to be spin up or spin down? Einstein and others working at quantum theory on the time introduced the idea of hidden variables. So what if when these particles were created, they contained some sort of hidden information about what their spin measurements would be in any direction? This would be a completely local phenomenon. When the particles were created, they would agree on a set of rules and go off on their way and never communicate again. And so we can think about what would happen with a hidden variable theory in a slightly more complicated experimental setup and see what this would imply about how the universe works. So suppose instead of measuring these particles in the same direction, I sent them off to 2 different detectors that measure them in one of 3 different directions, 0 degrees, 120, and 240 degrees. If a hidden variable theory were correct, when these particles were created, they would be assigned some set of properties, some set of rules about which way they would be, which spin they would give when measured in any direction, right? And so we can think about what a set of hidden variables could look like for each of these particles. For example, particle 1 could be up in every direction that it's measured. And then because we know that the particles must give opposite spins when measured in the same direction, particle 2 must be down in every direction measured. And that's the first row of this table here. We can think of different combinations of hidden variables though, right? Particle 1 could be up in 0, up in 120, down in 240. And then likewise, particle 2 would have to be down in 0, down in 120, up in 240, right? And so you can think about all possible combinations of hidden variables that these particles could have. And we can ask the question, what percent of the time will both detectors give up measurements or down measurements? So what percent of the time, if I send these two particles to each detector, measure in one of three different directions, will I see both detectors telling me up or both detectors telling me down? And so we can do a simple combinatorics problem and calculate that. And we see the most agreement that these measurements can ever have, given this hidden variable theory, is 4/9, 44%. If we look at the predictions of quantum theory, though, we see a 50% correlation predicted. And here you can see the quantum correlation curve for various detector angles. And you can see that almost all the time, except at very specific points, there is a disagreement between the quantum and the classical or local hidden variable theory. And so what does this mean? What did we assume about this system? We assumed that when the particles were created, they agreed on some set of rules, went off on their own ways, and never communicated again. But what quantum mechanics tells us is that this cannot be the case. When one particle is measured, it instantaneously affects the state of the second particle. And when Bell came up with this theorem, it was just theoretical, but recent Nobel Prize winning experimental work has shown that this is the reality. A local hidden variable theory cannot explain the observations of quantum mechanics. And so the exact interpretation of what is physically going on is depending on your interpretation of quantum mechanics. But I think an intuitive way to think about this is that when one system is measured, it completely affects the rest of the system, even at arbitrarily large distances. Now, this does not imply faster than light communication. We cannot use entangled particles to transmit information faster than the speed of light, even though this effect is non-local. But what entanglement does do is allow us to use novel methods of information manipulation and information transfer due to its non-local characteristics. So here I have a picture of quantum teleportation, which is one of the technologies exploiting entangled phenomena, which I think Jack may touch on a little more in his presentation. But with that, I would like to conclude. I hope this covers some of the general science necessary to understand both the classical internet and the future of the quantum internet, which will exploit properties like superposition and entanglement. And yeah, I'd like to turn it back over to Jared from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Max. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm bummed that we don't have faster than light communications, but I guess that's something we're going to have to reconcile with. I wanted to welcome next Jack Postlewaite, who's going to build off of Max's presentation and talk about the hardware side of these problems. So feel free to take it away, Jack.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me get my slides up here. And you should be able to see them now.
Yep, we can see them.
Awesome. So yeah, Max did a great job leading up to my talk here relating to entanglement and what it's all about. I'm actually going to take a step back at first, and then we're going to get back to entanglement in a second. But the purpose of my talk is to talk about how the internet network as a whole, the hardware that sits below it, will change with a coming quantum enhanced internet. So I'm going to start by laying out some of the basics again, things that we all know. But I want to point out again that the internet is a global megastructure of interconnected networks and interconnected devices, but it's also a platform of digital communication. So it's both physical and information bearing. This is a really cool diagram of just the complexity of the routing paths that exist out there. So a lot of people here clearly know about this, but yeah, it's this massive infrastructure that exists that we all use all the time. It's ubiquitous across human society. The numbers are staggering. This is a really cool visualization just showing the activity across a 24-hour period. And I want to talk more about this physical infrastructure that sits below it. So what sits there that drives this capacity for all of us to make these connections, to share this data? Well, it's mostly a network of fiber optic cables, electron bearing cables, and RF signals. Fiber optic cables have become increasingly relevant for both long haul communication. So things like what we see in this map here of undersea internet communications and also just international communications. But it's also becoming more relevant in things like server farms. So faster connections between devices, and increasingly in household use. In the US, we're nearing 50% of household internet connections being driven through fiber optic cables. So clearly this is a structure we want to build on. We can't recreate this in one day to build a quantum internet. So we want to be able to work with this. So let's look a little bit more into what actually is a fiber optic cable. So as you might imagine, this is a cable. At the center of it is a glass fiber here called the core, surrounded by claddings, coatings, strength members, outer jackets, and usually these are bundled together, many of them in one large bundle, especially for these undersea cables. The core and cladding are chosen intentionally to be of a specific refractive index, and this is conditioned on the wavelength of light that we're trying to let propagate through this. So in the case of most fiber optic cables today, we target a telecom band wavelength, which is approximately 1540 nanometers. And this allows the signal to propagate almost entirely inside of the fiber using total internal reflection. So based on the core and cladding index of refraction, you're able to assure that you have this large critical angle. So that way, pretty much all internal reflections, or it'll be pretty much entirely total internal reflection. So along the line, you're keeping most of your signal. You can propagate at huge distances right at the speed of light or the local speed of light in this refractive index. Now, there is still some loss in the signal, and this really amazing technology exists today to take that signal, boost it back up, and re-push it back out into the network. This process, this amplification process, is called erbium-doped fiber amplification. It essentially consists of a small fiber inserted into the network that is doped with these erbium ions, ER3+, and a three-wave mixing process occurs where your original signal is now mixed with a pump signal at 980 nanometers. Together, it boosts and resends out a new signal on the other end. So this is critical for long distance communications. Think on the order of hundreds or thousands of kilometers. And it makes this global internet traffic possible today using these undersea cables. So if we want to build a quantum enhanced internet, we clearly need to be able to leverage these technologies that exist. We need to be able to leverage fiber optic cables. But when we say what a quantum enhanced internet is, we need to really talk about what it is we're sending. So we're not talking about faster speeds on Netflix. We're not talking about more megabytes per second. We're talking about a new resource, and that's entanglement, like Max led us to. So the quantum internet, or rather the quantum enhanced internet, is about distributing entanglement over long distances and making it available for both commercial, personal, government uses, research uses, and leveraging the capacity of entanglement for new use cases. So I've listed out a few of them here. The first one, quantum key distribution, is really a tool to enable secure communications. David, who's talking after me, will go into a lot more detail on this topic, so I won't dwell on it. But there are other things too, like quantum distributed computing and also distributed quantum sensing, each of which requires entanglement to actually bring its benefits about. So distributed quantum computing, you can think of as connecting quantum computers to be able to solve larger problems, or more often, since most of us won't have a quantum computer in our pockets or anywhere near us for years to come, but we may need to use it for our research purposes, being able to create and then run computational circuits on these quantum computers remotely without the user or without the owner of the computer knowing exactly what it is that we're doing. Distributed quantum sensing has some amazing applications in things like terrestrial observations, bio observations, so this is like better diagnostic tools, and celestial observations. So I've shown here a little diagram of entanglement assisted long baseline interferometry, which you can think of as being a connection of multiple satellite receivers spread across large distances that take advantage of entanglement to interfere their received photons in a way that it acts as if there's one cohesive receiver that spreads over this whole distance. So instead of building larger and larger receivers to resolve smaller objects further away, we can distribute entanglement and take regular sized normal receivers that we can build today, take that in and build larger systems that are effectively the size of, say, the entire Earth or beyond. Now, there's a lot of cool applications here, but building a quantum enhanced internet also brings its own set of problems. There's the loss of the states are inherently more fragile, so they're more susceptible to noise. They also are difficult to couple between optical signals and into other platforms. But most importantly, you cannot directly amplify the signal. We cannot take the erbium process of before and boost our signal once it decays. And this is fundamental in quantum mechanics, and it's called the no cloning theorem. So this information needs to be, it cannot be read and then directly recreated. It's just an inherent property of quantum mechanics. In addition to solving these problems when trying to build a quantum enhanced internet, we have to do it in a way that's going to be massively scalable. And that in and of itself is an even larger challenge. So what are we doing to try to beat this? Like, what's our strategy here? The main thing that we're going to look at is using quantum teleportation, like Max led us to. So if we can't boost our signal with EDFA, and we can only get approximately 40 kilometers without losing our signal, then we need to figure out ways to build this teleportation network across larger distances. So I'll direct your attention to the bottom of the screen here, where I've made a little diagram depicting a network of quantum nodes. So in this case, Alice and Bob are the two users, and they're trying to generate shared entanglement. They have some use case. It could be any of the previous applications from quantum computing to sensing, but they need to have shared entanglement. Each of the nodes, approximately separated by 40 kilometers, would be a system that's performing a local measurement and generating an entangled pair and swapping entanglement between its adjacent nodes. So first, the node connected to Alice will swap entanglement with that in another node, connecting eventually all the way over to Bob. The process that occurs for this starts with taking an incoming signal state. So this is the state that we're trying to recreate. We're trying to transfer the state from Alice to Bob. That state is brought together with a pair of entangled photons, usually in like a polarization mode. And a Bell measurement is performed on both of these states. And by conditioning on the output, we're able to transfer the state into another mode. So in the diagram in the lower right side of the screen, you can start by imagining that the state psi c is our initial state. We're able to entangle this state with a pre-existing entanglement that exists between modes A and B. And by performing a Bell measurement and selecting on certain outcomes, we're able to recreate the state in output mode B. So we still have the same state psi, but it's in a different mode now. This process is probabilistic, so I want to make clear that it's not a guarantee that this happens every time. So making something that can do this very, very rapidly is critical to scaling the technology. One of the processes we're looking at to actually generate these repeaters or these nodes is what's known as a group 4 vacancy center. So you can imagine a large diamond lattice where two of the diamond atoms, as you can see in this diagram up here, have been removed. Interjected in between there, a single silicon or a single tin atom will have a splitting of its electron orbital that is now controllable and can be tuned such that it develops a local qubit level. So this is essentially just saying that your electron spin can be either up or down in this orbital, and we have control of that with external electromagnetic fields. The other really nice thing about these systems is that you have this local control, and it also matches with a ground state to excited state excitation that nears the telecom band. So earlier I mentioned 1540 nanometers is approximately telecom. Here you see it's 737. This is nice because it's actually able to be frequency doubled, so that way we can generate, or frequency half, so we can generate the right telecom band. But it's great because now we have control on a local level. We're able to interface it with these optical bands. And now the challenge is to build this in a scalable way. So for a sense of scale, I've shown some diagrams here of what these photonic crystals look like made of diamond. So you can see these are on like the micron scale. So they're very, very small. And the goal is to pack many of them together. And each of these probabilistic operations will as a whole be solvable then. Now, repeaters aren't the only solution. So I've told you that approximately 40 kilometers is the distance before the signal decays in fiber optics. And if you're looking at the orders of a few hundred kilometers, maybe several repeaters is the right technology, so on nationwide levels. But if you want to go international, or if you want to go across these massive distances, it would be possible to do it with repeaters, but it's also worth investigating what can satellites do. So a really interesting experiment that occurred just in the last few years is the Messias satellite from China, which first was launched in 2016 and demonstrated its ability to distribute entanglement across large distances. Later, it was able to perform QKD, and most recently was actually able to prove state teleportation over a distance of 1,200 kilometers. So this is really promising technology, particularly for space-based and international applications. All right, I've thrown a lot out there, information-wise, some of it really technical, but I want to have a few key takeaways. The first is that a quantum internet will distribute entanglement, which means EBITs. It's not about more megabytes. The applications include secure communications, improved astronomical imaging, distributed quantum computing. I could go on. And quantum repeaters are key to developing this terrestrial level control and building out this quantum network, whereas satellites might be our better use for space-based and for international quantum networks. So that's the end of my talk. Take it back, Jeremy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jack. I really liked your presentation, and I think it's really interesting how we're going to need both our terrestrial hardware and network system, but also this, satellite non-land-based system, similar to the classical internet, just with fancier crystals and cooler tech. So wonderful. For our final part of our session 3 technical deep dive, I want to welcome David City. David is an old friend of mine who is at the Yale ISP, where he studies a lot of things. And I believe, David, you are now a visiting assistant professor as well, which is really exciting. So David will be talking about quantum key distribution and other interesting new things in the security landscape with quantum networks. David, feel free to take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jer, and thanks to Jack and Max as well. Let's see if I can. Okay, so we've seen what polarization is from the previous 2 presentations, how it organizes light into a plane, synchronizing components of electrical field. So here we could see some light was polarized as it reflects off of a Fish's scale. We've also seen how polarization states of light can be treated in information theoretic terms, just a little bit, but how they're used to encode 2 values of a binary digit as qubits. The history of this is actually pretty interesting. Weissner was the first to observe it in the 1960s, that qubits could be used to do things in cryptography that you couldn't do with classical bits. So I'm going to focus on one of those new things, maybe the most well-known cryptographic application of quantum networks. It's called quantum key distribution, or QKD. So this is a schematic diagram of QKD as implemented by IBM. And I want to present a perspective on how QKD works that's more abstract than what's been shown so far, in order to try to highlight some of the practical security issues and to avoid tripping on details that I might not understand fully. Okay, so first some background. QKD solves a problem in cryptography that is part of what's called key management. So we've known for a long time how to do things if all you want is to encrypt something for yourself, so you can store it someplace safely and come back to it later. You just generate a small secret key and use an encryption algorithm to amplify or extend that key's secrecy over the data you want to protect. That's sort of the key thing, the essential thing that encryption algorithms do. The problem that QKD addresses is a second part of key management after generation, and that only comes up when you want to communicate. So how do you share a key with only your intended recipient so you can encrypt with it? One traditional kind of non-QKD answer for organizations like the military or intelligence agencies throughout history actually has been to have a trusted group generate and distribute key material. So at the NSA, for example, this is the central facility, which is part of the Electronic Key Management System, or EKMS. The central facility manufactures key material in a secured, shielded building underground. Actually, it's not the place listed because it's underground. That's Fort Meade that you see there. After the key is produced there, I guess I would call it the key layer. It's distributed by physically secure means. So that's something like that little key fill device that you see on the right. Okay, simple enough. Not everyone has the organizational resources of an NSA, though. So what if we want to distribute keys securely using only public shared channels that can be observed? Well, one answer there is to use public key cryptography, which is an innovation from the 70s in a scheme called Diffie-Hellman key agreement. So Diffie-Hellman is all over the place on the internet, on every website you retrieve using HTTP over TLS, in Tor, in emails, in SSH, in VPNs, and so on. And the details of Diffie-Hellman are not really necessary to go into here, except to note that the security properties that it has are based in well-founded but ultimately empirical complexity assumptions. So that is, there's a certain kind of problem whose difficulty Diffie-Hellman assumes for its security to grow very quickly as the size of the key grows, so that even for still feasibly sized keys, the work required to break Diffie-Hellman is not feasible to do. Okay, well, one problem with using complexity to keep keys secret is that some unforeseen breakthrough in computing or algorithms might compromise them. Like I said, it's an empirical thing, ultimately. And that's in effect what happened to Diffie-Hellman. Peter Shor, pictured here laughing at cryptographic security, came up with an algorithm that cleverly exploits the unique properties of quantum computation in order to efficiently solve a central part of a problem that Diffie-Hellman key agreement depends on for its security. Okay, so that brings us to QKD. QKD is a different kind of approach to key agreement over a public channel. It is working over a public channel like Diffie-Hellman, but it relies on properties of the light used to encode the data for security guarantees rather than encryption. I'm just assuming that we're using light, but actually in the history, there's been a variety of things. Okay, so QKD can be described in a setting where an Alice-Bob pair is communicating over two channels, one of which is quantum and the other one is classical, but both of which are assumed to be public. The quantum channel is assumed to be possibly actively interfered with by Eve, not just observed. So that's why I've put Meave there. So she's part Mallory, part Eve. I don't know. Yeah. So quantum channel can be actively interfered with, not just observed, while the classical channel is only passively observed. So the channels are seen here, top and bottom of the diagram. Okay, so for simplicity, let's look at agreeing on a key in one of the simplest versions of QKD called BB84. Alice first chooses two non-orthogonal polarization bases, the kind of thing that we heard about in the previous two talks. Let's call them HV and DA. You can see them pictured on the right just for intuition building. That gives us two ways to encode a 0 and two ways to encode a 1. Next, Alice chooses at least 4 bits at random. Some of these will be the secret bit keys, but she won't know which ones they are until the end. Incidentally, for that reason, sometimes people think of this as a key generation, a sort of distributed key generation method rather than a key exchange or key distribution method. But let's keep with thinking of it as key distribution. Okay, so Alice encodes each bit using one of the two bases, choosing at random. She then shares the resulting qubits with Bob over the quantum channel. So for the bit in row A in this diagram, this table here, Alice chooses HV and sends a qubit that's vertically polarized. The bit in row, the bit in row B is also a 1, but there she chooses DA and so sends a qubit that's anti-diagonally polarized, and so on. Bob, on the other hand, receives the qubits and announces this fact over the authenticated classical channel. Then he measures each photon in one of the two bases Alice announced. Remember, she announced it publicly, but just guesses at random which one she might have picked when she prepared it. So for row A, sent as vertically polarized, Bob here wrongly guesses DA and measures a 0 or a 1 with equal probability. For row C, we're going to skip B because there's some complications from Eve in that case. For row C, he guesses DA correctly and measures a 0. Next, Alice and Bob use the authenticated channel to publish their choice of bases, keeping only those qubits where the bases agree. In these cases, they will expect an error rate without interception. Increased error is going to be evidence of Eve. We'll get back to that. So Alice randomly chooses half of the bits where she and Bob have the same basis to be used as check bits. And then she publishes her choice, right? So she's trying to determine whether the error rate is indicative of Eve messing about on the channel. Okay, so she chooses half of them as check bits, publishes her choice, so that Alice and Bob can now both publish the values of those check bits. They then can determine whether what the disagreement is, and that will give you a measurement of error from all noise choices. So you can see disagreement in the cases with a rounded box in the table. And just to say it again, error here includes all sources, which includes passive interception, in addition to the usual effects of the channel. Passive interception is a kind of error. So the possibility of detecting interception as error and correcting for it is one of the main draws of QKD. It's totally exotic when as compared to classical communication. It's a way, you can think of it as a way of using a public channel without encryption and still having security by knowing you're not observed. It's like going out into a remote part of a desert, a place where you can see for miles around, to practice your terrible singing in secret. You're in public, but you know you're not being observed. Okay, so to clarify a bit, some amount of interception can be corrected for while still bounding the security of the key to an acceptable level. But the more interception there is, or the lossier the channel is, the shorter the key that can be extracted. So first, if the worst case of interception for the mistaken check bits is too high, the scheme has to be abandoned. But if not, if there's little enough interception, then a key can still be agreed upon with acceptable guarantees that Eve doesn't know it. And that's done by improving the raw key Alice and Bob have arrived at in a process that has a couple of stages. I'm just going to name them and not go into what they are really, but the first stage is error correction, which is just standard sort of error correction over the public channel, so that Alice and Bob arrive at the same corrected string of bits W. That might still leave Eve with a key that's unacceptably correlated to W, though. So after error correction, a subsequent process called privacy amplification is used to decrease the correlation between the result W and Eve's bits. And that results, the end result of that is a secure shared key S. And that's what we wanted, right? Now we have a shared key established over the public channel, which can be used for encryption that only Alice and Bob know, and nobody else. Okay, so now at last, it's time to look at some of the practical security issues with this setup. Time's short, so I'll just run through them rapid fire, but happy to elaborate on any sections that catch your eye in the questions. Okay, so to start, Alice makes use of a random number generator to choose her basis and generate key. The random number generator has to be unpredictable and has to produce its results unobserved and without modification to the process responsible for setting Alice's outgoing polarizer, right? She needs a sort of zone of protection. In general, nothing about Alice's activity that she doesn't announce on the public channel should be observable or influenced in a way that can reach Eve. And so that's indicated in this diagram with dotted lines around Alice and Bob. And I stole this idea from Norbert Lichtenhaus. Regarding the part about the number generator in particular, there are some observations from a societal impacts perspective that are apropos. The Bull Run program, which was revealed during the Snowden scandal and referred to in the document you see here, showed that the NSA had interfered in the NIST process for standardizing an RNG, or random number generator, to make it predictable. And there's a whole line of really interesting applied research pursued by Nadia Henninger on real-world random number generators. It's just to say that there are in practice attacks on RNGs. Am I over time, Jeremy? Sorry, I see you've come up here.
No, you're totally good, David. Keep going.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll zip through. Yeah, so as for the more general point that the hosts should be unobservable when not announcing things, as indicated by those dotted circles around the hosts in the diagram, there's a variety of side channels that can arise at the host. And in the early history, you have these devices that did funny things. You know, they were making these claims about perfect security in QKD, and then they would like buzz loudly only when sending a 1, right? It's very obvious side channels. So Dave Clark, one of the architects of the modern internet, wrote about the end-to-end argument and system design, highlighting exactly this sort of problem as a reason to avoid pushing security too far down in the protocol stack. Even if you protect information perfectly on a communication subnet, what used to be called communication subnet, that information ultimately needs to reach a process on the receiving host, which requires moving it up the stack on the host side. And that introduces a lot of possible interfaces as part of the attack surface. So side channels are a problem. Okay, next in the list of issues, there's the authenticated classical channel. I'll just say just very briefly that the problem here is, well, you're relying on classical cryptography to authenticate. And if you're going to do that, why wouldn't you use some kind of post-quantum classical cryptography for the key exchange step? right? What kind of PKI is involved in establishing binding between the key and an identity? Those are governance questions that are interesting and part of QKD and are ineliminable from QKD, despite the sort of tendency to sweep them under the rug. Finally, and this one relates to some of the things Jack was saying, we've already hinted at a kind of denial of service problem. If Eve acts too much like Bob and intercepts many of the bits that Alice is sending, key agreement's going to fail. But agreement also fails if the channel is too lossy. And the problem is that if you correct for correct channel loss by introducing lots of untrusted repeaters, because remember the channels are both public, you multiply the risk of interception. So over longer distances, the problem of denial of service grows. And so this is in fact quantifiable because you have proofs about repeaterless bounds that have been shown for desired key rate, what the minimum number of repeaters are required for a given distance. And so a lower bound on denial of service risk for QKD over a given distance can be given by just multiplying the minimum number of untrusted repeaters by a term representing something like per untrusted router risk. Okay, that's all. Just to conclude, we looked at some of the details of quantum key distribution schemes, allows two people to agree on a secret key. We also explored a few security problems that can arise in an implemented QKD system, and that includes attacks on endpoints, authentication on the classical channel, denial of service. These aren't supposed to be devastating objections. I'm sure you can see ways to rehabilitate, but just examples of what practical considerations can arise for a protocol commonly said to be perfectly secure in a more theoretical sense. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. I always really enjoy your talks for the depth and the technicality and all of the really good insights. I also really appreciate how you bring together the idea that a lot of internet governance people don't address, which is that the NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, I believe is the full acronym, is also one of these parties that does have, tremendous control over the future of security and protocol development and other things like that. And I think that's something that the field should be more interested in and more attuned to. I know they do a lot of stuff with DNSSEC and stuff like that, but broadly speaking, very interesting. Thank you so much. I want to be aware of time and move to our final panelist. It might seem kind of impossible, but we are going to try to encapsulate the wide and really interesting range of topics we've heard today. So from the start with Naila about what ICANN is and what internet governance is from the institutional non-governmental side, as it states today, to Nick's really insightful, wide-ranging and geopolitically oriented look at how internet governance does have all of these downstream effects, but is also this very technocratic, multi-stakeholder ecosystem. And then now to these really, deep and insightful technical talks about what the future of communications networks technologies are going to look like, and what implications they have for security, for hardware, for the broader physics and optics landscapes is really great. So in thinking about all this, I wanted to bring the only person I know that might be able to touch on each of these in some degree, and still really add to this fruitful conversation. So I want to bring in Nick Merrill for a talk on quantum futures and what comes next for the internet governance model. Nick is an old friend of mine. He's the director of the Daylight Lab, which, as part of our earlier conversation with Nick Nugent, the Daylight Lab does work on internet fragmentation, trying to measure the impacts on real networks. Nick is also a member of UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, which goes into a lot of these questions that David has addressed here with QKD and other things that I know the CLTC has really interesting people working on. So I'm really excited to have Nick here. Nick is always somebody who brings a really great insight and multidisciplinary perspective to these questions. So welcome, Nick.
Hey, great to be here. And thank you so much for your kind words, Jeremy.
Awesome. So I wanted to start out by asking you kind of a through line question. So in this talk today, we've thought a lot about these institutional power structures, right? These private governance groups and mostly actors from these groups who have had relative success, most would argue, in maintaining the stable global operation of the internet over the last 20 years. But as I see it, there's sort of this contrary relationship in this power dynamic, right? Most of the internet, the software and hardware side, is run by open source technology, which is developed arguably by actors who aren't employed by these big corporations, and through trust models that deliberately buck this kind of maybe capitalist market system in which private governance has been established. I know you're somebody who thinks about this and spends a lot of space in these open source communities, and I wanted your perspective on how we could sort of reconcile the success of private governance models using sort of open source methods to how most of the internet actually runs, which is on protocols and other things that are largely built by people, who are not employed by, big corporations.
Yeah, it's a great tension and such an interesting topic to talk about. One of the most interesting questions in all of the internet, I believe. We could probably poke and prod at some of the assumptions behind this tension, like as you seem to have referenced, Jeremy, this idea that people who contribute to open source software indeed do not have incentives that beholden to these private actors. That may or may not be the case. And in all cases, in fact, there are a lot of entanglements there. But let's take this premise and run with it, right? Open source software, my postdoc advisor, Steve Weber, wrote a book about open source software, the first book about open source software. And the core mystery behind this book is this idea of why do people do this? Why do people contribute to open source software? What is this incentive structure? And is it really just for fun? So listen, the world is changing fast. I think immediately after that book was written, there started to become incentive structures around open source, monetary incentive structures. Red Hat was one of the earliest to monetize open source development by arbitraging kind of inside the open source community versus outside relative knowledge about this things works. You get everyone hooked on this product, so to speak, and I'm very cynical here. They come to rely on it. Well, hey, the actual particularities are very complex. Sometimes people need different kind of functionality. We can grease the wheels a little bit with some money and provide some white glove support for this open source tool. Doesn't mean that the open source tool is the common good. Doesn't mean that those people had a monetary incentive to get involved with it in the first place. But now that they're there, they find themselves in the situation where they have a monetary incentive. Now, a lot of the internet does work using this incentive, and there are even new things like DAOs and stuff that, Gitcoin. There are all of these kind of different schemes for incentivizing open source. But again, going back to when Steve Weber wrote that book, I know this is a bit of a shaggy dog story, but it's a complex question, right? So back when Steve Weber wrote that book, really there weren't the same level of monetary incentives. It really was the case that people got together and did this crazy thing, and it did produce a public good. And the philosophy and the incentives and the way that these different communities related to each other, partially overlapping, produced this open source ecosystem so robust that became Linux, a perfectly functional, not just operating system, but desktop environment, drivers, all of these things that you need to run a computer. Linux really emerged through that not incentivized model back in the day. And in many ways, this is similar to the original dream of the internet, that we could have all of these independent, maybe internal to a particular autonomous system, there would have been a monetary incentive like an ISP, small scale ISP, right? But that these ASs would relate to each other in this flexible way. And the ecosystem that emerged would be this flexible emergent organism that is the internet. And we find ourselves today in a paradox. And I think that the paradox is similar between open source and the internet, which is that we do have these flexible and emergent ecosystems, organismic kind of beings, one Linux and the internet both. Yet the way that we imagine those systems as being somehow incentive-free and voluntary, it's a little more complex than that in the end. And we have found ourselves almost pushing up against the story about the complex and emergent nature of the internet, because these providers have become so centralized privately, large corporations, and centralized in the United States jurisdiction, with some exceptions, of course. But if we zoom out and look at the internet, it's private companies in the United States, not very many of them, right? So where does the story leave us? I mean, what is the story that we've been telling ourselves about the internet even true anymore? To me, that is the primary question. And the stability, which I believe was the original intent of this question, right? The stability that we saw, the story we tell ourselves is that the stability comes from the complexity and emergence. If something goes down, we can route around the failure. This is the story we tell ourselves, right? Today, we have to update our story about how the stability actually comes about. what actually are the conditions that lead to the stability? Is it really that complex emergent relationship, which perhaps describes the internet stability at the technical level? Perhaps it describes why a particular cable can go down. We can still route packets around that failure. It does not, however, describe it at the political level. We do not have a coherent theory that explains to us why the internet is as stable as it is at the political structural level that governs those technical infrastructures. To me, that's one of the core puzzles. I have a hunch, which is basically drawing from hegemonic stability theory, this idea that global trade is the case in this theory, that purportedly decentralized common good system is actually most stable when a hegemon controls it. We're not quite at a hegemon, right? We're getting there in the sense that these tech companies are hegemonic in the way that they relate to themselves and each other. So I'll stop there.
No, fascinating. And I really appreciate that start because it pulls a lot of the initial threads of what I'm interested in talking about as well. I wanted to first push on that because we actually did spend some time with Nick Nugent talking about the idea of hegemony changing, right? So there is soft fragmentation and hard fragmentation, which Nick elucidated are two very different things, right? There's one where it's the kind of sovereign closing off of the networks, becoming this very insular communication system. And then soft fragmentation being trade and other policies or privacy frameworks that make it more challenging for interoperability around the globe to be stable and consistent. I'm curious as to how you see that as somebody who does research on the front lines of that. I know it strays a little bit away from internet governance participation, like Steve has been talking, Steve Weber, that you mentioned, talks about, but how do you see these questions of stability and fragmentation in today's very, very polarized internet landscape and geopolitical landscape?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I can only give you philosophical answers here because a lot of when I'm thinking about the data, right, I'm thinking about specific kind of blocking events and how they fit together and how they use different parts of the technical stack to enact, right? But the philosophical picture that I see is that internet governance is this really heterogeneous ordering of the internet. And we all partake in it. Anytime we modify this global internet, we're taking our small part in internet governance. It really is a shared infrastructure in that way. But of course, as we have all probably discussed the rest of the day, although I wasn't here, it's not that simple. There are some actors that have more control, more governance than others, right? And I think what we see about internet fragmentation, although there's soft and hard, and we could probably argue all day about what the difference is between soft and hard and categorize one or the other, and what kind of normative assumptions are built into that categorization or our desire to do it, what we can say about internet fragmentation is that it's a type of governance that happens unilaterally. It's a quality that I think that we ascribe to the way that the decision was made with respect to all of the other operators on this internet. And internet fragmentation in that sense, it is not only the domain of national actors, right? It's the domain of anyone who's able to do that kind of unilateral action. And especially when it produces these effects, and I think that this is where the fragmentation really comes in, that are differential globally. Where you are, what internet access you have access to, dictates the kind of internet that you see. And although a lot of attention and time is focused on national actors doing these things, especially censorship, sucks up a lot of the airtime for good reason, right? But it's not the only way. And if you've ever tried to, be from Ghana and access the internet, you're going to have a really hard time, and you're not going to be able to see things that people, in the global north and in Western Europe can access. This is a kind of fragmentation too. It has nothing to do with national actors. Maybe the borders are relevant, the ISPs are relevant in enacting it, but it's private companies like Cloudflare deciding that, people from Ghana don't make us enough money. We're just going to treat them all as spam. That's simple, right? And those are like this whole picture of fragmentation. It's this very multifaceted political sphere. And apologies, I'm sure Nick Nugent said exactly the same thing earlier today. But that's how I look at it, right? It's this unilateral internet governance that is normatively bad.
Fascinating. I really like that, and I think maybe this is an unfair analogy to make, but it's really interesting how you describe the infrastructural development and the difference between infrastructure development between, say, the global north and the global south does create fragmentation in a way that conceptually I don't think we address in our conversations in these institutions. I think it's really akin to other basic development questions of like who has access to what and who are importing those resources in. It speaks to this kind of global, broader dynamic of inequity and, historical power dynamics and relationships between states and non-state actors. And it's all very, very fascinating. I wanted to push left again, back to kind of the original question. I think you're somebody who's really at the forefront of a lot of questions related to participation, design, trust, and are interested in like new frameworks and new governance structures that are interested in enabling those participation models to either be more equitable or to bring in the right parties that could more responsibly steer something for a mass of people like the internet. I'd be curious as to what you think about the current internet governance institutional landscape and the model specifically like multi-stakeholderism and their effect on actual participation. Do you think that they're a strong model for 2022 internet standards and development work, or do you think that they are maybe just what's a more cynical way of putting it? They're a thing we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel good at night that we're including actors who historically have not been given access to these institutions.
Yeah, listen, I can answer this question without making reference to any specific current internet governance structure, because otherwise I get myself into trouble and people land in my inbox. And so listen, philosophically, I am a fan of kind of direct governance when desired. If you want to have direct governance over this internet, you deserve to have direct governance over this internet. And what we see in often, and I work with Deirdre Mulligan at UC Berkeley School of Information, she's a professor there. Tech delegation is her area, in my mind that she kind of is her matter of concern. Tech delegation is important, it's necessary, we ought to be able to delegate. But again, delegation here is a choice. I had capacity to control my fate, and I've delegated it to someone else because, I don't have time to do every single decision. If you live in California, you have all these ballot props, you probably wish you had a little bit more delegation, right? Let our policymakers, let our regulators figure these questions out, and don't ask me about this stuff. Delegation is important, but it all starts with that ability to delegate. And my ultimate critique about internet governance, and really structurally to the internet, is that we were never given this delegation option in the first place. And the way I see, and Jeremy, you already know this, for the rest of the group and whoever's listening, my proposal is to re-architect autonomous systems, those things that are your ISP, the structural units of which the internet is composed, and make them democratically controllable. If you are a natural-born person who has a subscription to your ISP, you deserve to have a vote in any matter of internet governance. And really, you can do so directly because the way the internet is put together really does percolate up from the bottom. These people who are connected to ISPs ought to have a say, right? Now, that's how to govern an internet. How do we build an internet where we get access to people who deserve to have access to the internet? How do we get them interested in having that kind of access? Those are different questions. I wish I had answers to these things, but they're the important questions to ask because we could architect something fantastic. And if we don't have access shared equitably, then we're back in the world we already live in.
That's really interesting. I want to pull on two threads there, both on the delegation end and on the direct democracy and participation side. One of the fundamental critiques, and this is a lived experience of mine as somebody who isn't a member of the broader technical community, but is somebody who studies social sciences and law. A lot of these questions that are being addressed in maybe your local ISP's monthly meeting or other things are fundamentally out of reach for audiences, right? But have downstream, massive effects on, everyday people like me. How do we both create incentives, but also information symmetry rather than asymmetries here, to where there is more accessibility to both the information that an organization like ICANN, or maybe low or higher in the stack with your ISP, or say even your platform that you're using, whether it's Mastodon or Twitter. How do we create, or idealize, probably, because creating is not possible in our private economic system, but how do we idealize an incentive and a information sharing economy that makes it possible for us to participate meaningfully in these decisions in the way that we participate meaningfully in political venues, and on stuff like your, ballot proposition idea?
Yeah, again, this is a fascinating question. I think as people who work on the internet, we often convince ourselves that the internet is so unique. And in many ways, of course, it is. But in this one particular way, it's really not that unique at all. My partner is a transportation planner. She works at a big regional agency that manages transportation for the entire Bay Area. Transportation is a perfect example of how delegation can work well. It's a common good. We all benefit from it. But, newsflash, it's highly technical. And there does need to be someone in that loop, like my partner, who's doing this kind of analysis and discussing, really in a way that people cannot understand without an advanced degree and a lot of study, how it works and how these decisions were made. What we have, however, in between, someone like my partner and someone like me, just an everyday person, are elected officials who delegate successively in turn to people who are able to make these decisions. And because they are accountable in an ideal world, not necessarily in the world we live in, but in an ideal world, because they are accountable to my vote, they are forced to explain it to me in a way that I can understand. And if they can't do it, they need to figure out how. And what happens when we see in practice, again, in the Bay Area, where really my elected official actually is quite accountable. I'm in a very politically active and high voting rate, college town, right? Famously so. So, when the guy who sits on ABAG at our local committee, he really does get people who are sometimes quite angry. And it has, for good reason, that people have been really marginalized by transportation planning, just as they have by the internet. Things like highways or train tracks that divide communities. People come with legitimate issues, and Jesse has to come back with answers. And what we see in practice is that there are layers of delegation behind Jesse, and also people from this agency reporting to Jesse, and he asks them questions, such that he's able to perform this accountability. And that accountability step is what we don't have on the internet, right? There are people who make these decisions. There are people who understand them. There are even people who, like me and you, Jeremy, who explain them to normal people in a way that we'd hope, in your case, maybe not more than mine, that they can understand. And what's missing there is the accountability. How we delegate up to that person who ultimately does know what they're doing, and in a way that can be translated back, and there's an incentive to.
Two ideas there. So the first is, I think we've seen an effective, or maybe in some places not effective, model of this in our traditional utility sectors, right? We have things like corporation commissions that do set standards and rates and all these things for these kind of essential public goods that otherwise are natural monopolies that are outside of, the control of a private organization's, reach, or outside of the public's accessibility in a knowledge situation. I wonder if the way forward in that question of, we're still in this kind of representative democracy level system where we are participating in questions related to our internet experience through, elected representatives, whether that's the way forward, or is it something more akin to how open source development works, where there is a, user who is taking in random queries from other users, or, edits, or whatever it be, and is, forking and pushing those, new things to the broader system. I wonder what, in your eyes, as somebody who's very conceptual and interested in this kind of system-wide thinking, what would be maybe a more effective model, or what model does the internet seem to function better with? Because I worry that, both systems, the Corporation Commission and the open source development, get pull and push model, are both alienating to everyday users who might not have, the general interest in lowering these things.
Yeah, these are great questions. I think, although this may be an unsatisfying answer, and I will probably get angry emails from this as well, I don't think we can be so confident that the internet actually does work well today. It hasn't been around that long. And it hasn't been through massive wars and geopolitical changes as many other kinds of utilities and infrastructure have. The jury's out. And I would say the same thing about open source. This is really the thing I think I'm going to get angry emails about. We could say the same thing about open source. Open source seems to be reasonably secure. It may also be the case that a lot of national intelligence agencies are hoarding vulnerabilities and keeping good track of them. And we're going to actually see chaos, and it doesn't work well at all. So, jury's out on how well this works, right? Now, how should it work? Normatively, how should we make this work? You know, that highly reductive political spectrum, 4x4, you get the top left, whatever. Every quadrant of that has an answer to this question, right? And, you know, the tech is kind of the you know, authoritarian right wing, well, I don't know, whatever. I'm not really bought into this chart in the first place, but there are a lot of competing ideas for what can happen here. And you know, on my side of the chart, kind of, there's this thing that worked actually very well during the Great Depression, which were utility cooperatives. Utility cooperatives really built infrastructure, and you know, people wonder, why do we have you know, such great electricity service in rural America when we have such terrible broadband service? And well, they were built by co-ops. They were built by people with direct governance over these things, and that's my model. Okay, that normatively, that's my answer for how this can work well and be robust. And as far as the way it works now and describing, oh, why has it been as stable as it is, we have to wait on history, actually, to see, I think, some of the answers to these questions. And when I talk to people, they seem so sure that the internet was good and now is destabilizing, as opposed to the internet was structured basically the same way the whole time, and actually just that structure isn't very good. So we're just going to have to see.
That's interesting. It's the fallibility of writing history in real time. You know, we are both the actors doing it and the people trying to revise it as we go. I like that idea of a utility co-op. I know the Tennessee Valley Electrical Authority is one of the kind of famous ones, and I know that their rates are somehow like drastically lower than most of America, and their service quality is superior. So something interesting to think about. I wanted to ask one more question and to kind of wrap up what I think is a really interesting discussion, both from you and from all of our panelists. And that comes down to like one of the really essential and interesting quandaries of the internet. And that is trust. I know you had a recent post about this, about trustware and your ideas on these systems, but to me, one of the foundational questions that we're facing, both from governance and from platforms, broadly the whole stack, right, is how do we know that we can trust either the people that we're developing policies and frameworks with, or nation states that we're working with, or other users that we're interacting with, to build this participatory, you know, global public good in a way for, you know, the future and for the public good going forward. So out of curiosity, in this kind of an incentive design layer sort of questions, in your eyes, how do we foment and establish trust in what seems to be an internet that's not only destabilizing in some way, or has always been unstable, but is also becoming increasingly hostile and increasingly threatening between users and between ISPs and ASs who might, you know, be sending bad routes, or even, you know, the ITU and ICANN at the highest level, who are distrustful of each other's intentions and don't necessarily want to work together to promote what is essentially akin to, you know, a very necessary public resource like water or electricity.
Yeah, these are great questions. So, you know, listen, if I had to summarize that blog post on trustware, it's that different kinds of trust relationships need to be assured in different ways, depending on the domain. And those domains and what we're trying to achieve are very much intrinsically wrapped up in kind of social power and social other kinds of social. So, you know, to answer your question, yeah, it's highly contextual the way we implement it technically, and it's wrapped up in social context. However, you know, on a broad scale, right, to really give a more satisfying answer, the one thing to my mind, that's missing on the internet is a great way cryptographically of portraying that you've been verified as an actual real living person. Because we have a problem on the internet that's kind of, in many ways, on top of our problem with establishing trust well, which is that we don't know what's real and what's fake. And machine learning and generative machine learning in particular is exacerbating this problem. So soon we're going to have a big bot problem, bigger bot problem, bigger problem with not just automated content, but automated agents that are generating this content, really interacting with you in a way that you know is real, but not necessarily human. And this idea of proving personhood, proving again is a loaded word. It means something different to cryptographers than it means to normal people. But this idea of cryptographically enacting personhood or some notion of it and transmitting that to other people is an important missing component on the internet. And just making sure that you are indeed transacting with a person that has been verified using some system that you know and trust, some institution that you know and trust, is would be a fantastic first step, understanding that there might still be fragmentation there. It won't necessarily be global.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Nick. I'm not going to say that we have solved trust or coordination or fragmentation today, but I think we're adding interesting nuance to the dialogue that is forming around these very essential questions in the next decade of internet governance work and policy work. And so I really appreciate you being here. I wanted to thank our attendees and our other panelists as well in the Center for Quantum Networks for hosting this event. It will be up on YouTube after this, and please feel free to email me or any of our panelists for more questions or avenues to get involved. Again, the idea behind this event is for young technical or non-technical audiences to understand that there is this universe out there that is accessible and interesting and really important to the future of all of these tools that you take for granted and that you use every day. And so with that, I will close and say thank you to everybody and looking forward to our future conversations.